Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay. Welcome, Austin and Jim. It's time for our yearly preview. I would imagine the preview is going to involve a lot about Iran, Jim.
Well, yeah, I think there's something we should get out of the way right now because of what is happening right now with Iran. One thing people lose sight of, this is based upon historical experience. Hotspots or potential hotspots like North Korea and Iran in particular, and I guess you could say Russia, is that the last thing they want is an actual war. Because they all know, we stand back and we analyze their military capabilities and we report on it regularly and what have you. And the fact of the matter is that all these three countries are military midgets. All have been declining mainly because of economic reasons. Many of them, all of them self-inflicted. The ongoing violence since 2017 in Iran, popular protests, have been about people finally realizing that the main obstacle to their, prosperity is not American sanctions. It's not, schemes by Israel or the CIA or what have you. It's their own rulers because they can see up front and personal corruption every day. The IRGC, which is the royal guard, as it were, protecting the religious leaders, the religious dictatorship, as it were, the Guardian Council, from overthrow by the rest of Iran, including the regular military. The IRGC, one of whose generals, Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force Division, is and constantly amassing more economic power. They basically have the right to seize, the assets of enemies of the state, et cetera, et cetera. As part of the government, they have enjoyed the initial seizure of all the monarchy, the royalties assets, the aristocracy, mainly the Shah, and then over the decades, more and more of the economy has been absorbed by the clergy. Basically, it sounds like medieval Roman Catholic Church. But anyway, the problem is that they are not able to build up a conventional military force because they don't trust it, and so they pour a lot of money into the IRGC. Which basically has its own air force, its own navy, and of course an army. And they spend most of their time now aggrandizing themselves. It's mainly their families because they have basically the most senior leaders lead clans. Over 100 blood kin, as it were. And one of the more embarrassing aspects of this is with the proliferation of the internet. A lot of the younger members, the grandchildren, as it were, of the senior clergy, are getting on the internet and showing off their wealth, which has caused some very embarrassing situations, which are still going on. And if this is reminiscent of the Soviet Union in the 1980s, it is, because this is a cycle that all dictatorships go through. It happened in Syria with the Assads. They're not as rich as they used to be, but they're still the richest people in the country. And they pretend they have a powerful military. They threaten their neighbors. They try and bully, concessions. For a long time, even the West was reluctant to call their bluff. Well, now it's happening. And guess what? They back off. North Korea and Iran believe that if they had nukes, nobody would call their bluff anymore. Well, I think they're in for a rude surprise. But the fact is their biggest enemies are internal. North Korea hasn't had an internal insurrection yet, but again, we report this regularly. If you read our stuff over the last 10 years, you'll see there's been more and more internal dissent in North Korea. Graffiti, which was unheard of, 10 years ago, is now fairly common. It's even being inflicted, as it were, on the shrines of the Kim family, which are considered sacred. That's a death sentence if you call it scrawling, food for the people on a Kim shrine, but it's actually happening. And that's a double sacrilege, because the local party officials are supposed to post guards on these shrines to ensure there is nothing like that happening, and it's happening anyway. So you can see the decline going on there. Well, it's been going on in Iran as well, and in Iran, it's gotten even worse in the last few years. Again, we're reporting from open sources. The aristocracy, the senior clergy who run the place, who have the final power, they've been openly complaining about the state of the military. And one of the things they've been particularly, uneasy about in the last couple of years, and again, they've made public pronouncements about this. There have been a lot of senior officers in the Air Defense Command, in the Air Force, and what have you, being fired for not basically fixing it. Is problems with the Air Force, which basically doesn't exist. I mean, they have a lot of old aircraft which they can get in the air, but that's about all they can do. They'll provide target practice for someone else. The Air Defense Command, which was supposed to be strengthened by new Russian equipment, well, that apparently shot down a Ukrainian airliner, killing mostly foreigners on their way to the Ukraine. And apparently we got a satellite photo of that. We were monitoring, as one would expect at that time. That was right after the rockets were launched a few days ago. We were basically had the Keyhole 11 collecting live video of what was going on over Tehran. And this was over Tehran, where a lot of their air defense systems are. And apparently there was a live video of the aircraft being tagged by a Tor-1 missile, which is a late model Russian system. And I believe it's that same one that brought down the Malaysian airliner over Ukraine in what was that, 2015? Anyway, this is an example of the problems they're having. Even when they have modern equipment, they don't really have disciplined, well-trained people handling it. Although in the case of Iran and the Panzer Tor systems, these are relatively new systems, and they have had a problem in Syria where apparently they don't work too well when you're actually trying to hit something you want to hit, not something that's accidentally flying by and it's an airliner. So the main areas where we're having combat going on continuously and a lot of casualties are places we don't consider hotspots. For example, the most of them are, the top 10. How should I put it? Disaster areas in the country, in the world, and this list hasn't changed much. It basically includes Yemen, which is. There is some fighting, but mostly it's a lot of people sitting around starving. Congo, which Austin's been reporting on for decades, and that's a lot of starvation, a lot of rampant, violence and what have you. South Sudan, which actually may drop off the list, top 10 in this coming year, because they have finally achieved a ceasefire, a truce that's holding, and that is mainly out of exhaustion. In other words, there's no food. There's nothing. And the warring factions, which are basically two tribal coalitions led by the president and the former vice president, have decided, maybe we better stop for a while, catch our breath, and then go resume fighting later. There's Afghanistan, the perennial, Venezuela, which interestingly enough is probably going to drop off the list because I don't know if a lot of people have noticed this. They've started to eliminate the socialism. They still got a socialist dictatorship. It's funny, that's how it works. The dictatorship never goes away, but even North Korea and Cuba have adopted a lot of open free market practices in order to stay afloat financially. In fact, in Venezuela, there are more people do financial transactions with dollars than with the local currency, which is no longer inflating as much as it used to, but it's still got inflation over 1,000% a year. That's down from a couple of million% a year. A number of African countries, Central African Republic, Austin's been covering that mess for a long time. That's a sad situation. Syria, Nigeria, Ethiopia. Ethiopia you don't hear much about, but again, that's ethnic, tribal. Basically Christian tribe, which is the majority, and some Muslim tribes. And then there's some Somalis in one part of Ethiopia, which are always annoying for everyone concerned. And of course, Somalia itself, which is basically one of those failed states, which was never a state. In fact, if you look at these from the viewpoint of failed states, almost all the failed states are on this list. The main failed states, the places we call countries, but were never countries in the modern sense, are Afghanistan and Yemen. And again, if you look at our coverage of Yemen, we repeat that little, brief 2-paragraph history of how it wasn't a country when the British moved in the 19th century, and when the British left 50 years ago, it was 2 countries actually. They reunited in the 1990s. They had to fight again. Then they stayed united, and now they're trying to break up again. So, things don't change. Afghanistan is another story we explain. Afghanistan is complicated by the fact that the main motivation there to keep on fighting is drug money. It's the main producer of heroin on the planet. And apparently there's some moves in Afghanistan to try to get into fentanyl production, which is more of an industrial process, but they're business savvy as far as their product goes. But as far as aiding the well-being of the entire country, the drug business is a total bust. And in a country like Afghanistan, which has enough problems to begin with, it's just one more layer of misery, one more layer of intractable or difficult problems that have to be solved. So these are places where there's a lot of shooting going on, whereas in Iran and North Korea, there's not much actual combat, although they get most of the news. Now, the reason there is, again, the nukes. Now, that is a terra incognita, because there are only 2 countries we have to worry about with nukes, and that is India and Pakistan. Again, Pakistan should be on this list. It used to be because of the terrorism deaths, but they've fallen off it because they basically suppressed all the terrorists they had created who were in the country and chased them all into Afghanistan. But they are still encouraging much of the terrorism in Afghanistan, and some of it in India. India's main problem is not religious-based terrorism. It's people have a hard time grasping this. Communist rebels in eastern India, plus tribal rebels in northeastern India. But anyway, that's another story. You can read about it in Strategy Page, and you'll be, amused in a sort of macabre way. So the future hotspots are basically the past hotspots with a few minor changes. And that may not sound encouraging, but, at least it's predictable.
Dan, let me make a comment on the Eastern Indian problem with the communist rebels. There is some indication, again, Jim said the magic words open source, and that's what we rely on, that there's a Chinese finger in the troublemaking communist. Also in the Philippines, there is a remnant Philippine communist movement, nominally Maoist, whatever that means in the 21st century, means in some way connected to China. So they are still active, barely. That the communist insurgents dormant in the Philippines. The Islamic insurgency that was the legitimate one by the Moros is more or less subsided. You still have the affiliate with the Islamic State setting off bombs. But I want to make a comment on that, on Jim's note on the trouble in India. Look, you could go through to add some other places. Jim brought up Central African Republic, which I don't mean to chuckle at it. It's just absolutely sad. Last year, in mid-February, the UN and the new government, as such as it is, it's really just in Bangui because it has no authority, no ability to do anything outside of Bangui. It relies on MINUSCA, the UN peacekeeping force there for for policing, minimal policing in the rest of the country. But they succeeded. The new government. The leadership there was regarded as clean, particularly compared to the former rebels in the former rebel force Salika, which was predominantly Muslim, on the old Bouaziz administration, even though he's returned from exile. The government succeeded in getting 14 of the key warring factions, got that, Dan? 14 of the key warring factions to agree to a peace settlement. And about 10 or 11 of them throughout the year honored it. Three, maybe four got into it. The problem is that there is another movement going on in the Eastern Central African Republic. We're mixing up our directions there, of course. Eastern Central African Republic, that's deeply involved with smuggling, and also associated with an ongoing small-scale insurgency in Cameroon, and also smuggling going on into South Sudan and into Congo with some other tribes that are located in the southwest. If I said eastern, I meant western with the insurgency with Congo. It's Western Central African Republic. In other words, the situation is so anarchic, and it's again based on tribalism. There are sectarian divisions that gets most of the attention between the anti-Balaka and the movement and the remnants of Saleka, but the tribalism and crime. And why am I going into some detail in the Central African Republic? Because in some ways it is the best example of the kinds of illnesses in failed states or never states that Jim was talking about, where you see these, where the shooting continues. Some of that applies to Mali as well, and Niger, even though you've got the insurgency there that's run by, well, they were Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. Now it's Islamic State in the Islamic Maghreb, meaning the Western Northern Africa. And they are involved with Boko Haram, which is still around in Nigeria, committed some absolutely heavy atrocities. What was it, Jim, about 5 or 6 weeks ago?
Yeah.
I know we covered it. I looked at it. Even though the Nigerian government has been, you're going to have to give them credit for suppressing the worst of Boko Haram. They haven't taken them off the map, but they're in Nigeria, which there is a Nigerian core, a CORE state of a sorts, built around the oil industry and in the Niger River Delta, but it's riven by tribalism. The Igbo, with the old Biafran insurgency of the 1960s, the Igbo are still there. And though they got beat in that civil war, they have their own separate identity from the rest of Nigeria. So there's a place in southern in that case sub-Saharan Africa that has money, education comparatively, and culture, yet it's still riven by the same issues that you see in some of these other failed states. I'm not saying Nigeria is a failed state, but it's got the issues there of tribalism and corruption. In this case, corruption around something that's worth something, meaning the oil industry. Jim talked about Yemen, or he talked about Syria, and I've mentioned the Philippines. That's shooting with AK-47s, occasionally mortar rounds, and it's complicated too. Jim mentioned people in Yemen now starving. I've written that column 3 times, Dan, within the last 7 or 8 years about Yemen, about how starvation's a tool there. That's also been a tool in southern Sudan. The Sudanese government, meaning now northern Sudan, Khartoum, used starvation as a tool for war, as a weapon in Darfur. Darfur hasn't gone away either, but it's more now back to a small-scale tribal insurgency, and they're at least talking about reaching a settlement with the government. Sudan is one of the few places, and I think we mentioned this in our review of 2019. I know I did in a column I wrote. Is one of the few good stories out of, out of Africa, Middle East, in terms of, for that matter, Central Asia, in terms of an improvement in 2019, and that was with the demise of the Bashir dictatorship and the rise of this split personality sovereign council that runs the country now. You've got a prime minister who is actually interested in ending Darfur, and also what's the war in South Kordofan and Blue Nile states. That's really largely become dormant. There's still reports occasionally of shootouts, but the Sudanese government has. The new one has made efforts to stop the Sudanese Air Force from dropping bombs on Nur villages in the Nuba Mountains, which would, because of the porosity of the internet and also the use by some human rights groups of very effective satellite coverage, the Khartoum can't get away with that anymore. Let's go back to. Jim said, there's North Korea's in a crooked nowhere land looking for nuclear weapons and with an archaic communist regime. And I'm going to avoid getting into the nitty-gritty of the Trump administration's attempts to denuclearize it. We can discuss that. We've discussed it in the past. We'll discuss it again. Those are continuing. Kim didn't pop his Christmas present, New Year's Day Roman candle, but that still is a dangerous situation. It's a frozen war, dangerous situation. Iran, after what was done at the end of this beginning of the year, really, with General Soleimani, there's a lesson on how far state-sponsored terror will take you. I think 2020, it will be interesting to see if that has other effects on Iran and also other terror groups around the world, but more specifically in the Middle East and Central Asia. And for that matter, the Horn of Africa, because there are connections, and one of the connections has been the Al-Quds group that Soleimani directed. He's dealing with Sunnis, he's dealing with non-Muslims, but he was able to provide financial aid, weapons, and training, and some of it overt, a lot of it covert. I'm not saying it was only his network, but it was. He certainly had a finger in that. The Iranians have a finger in what was going on in Somalia, and a small-scale insurgency in Djibouti, even though that has largely dissipated. It'll be interesting to see if there are calming effects. How do you like that word, Jim? From the demise of General Soleimani. China. Hong Kong had a very large protest demonstration, more celebratory, during Christmas week. Again, to make the point pro-democracy, overtly pro-democracy, to make the point that they haven't gone away. China is watching and waiting. Could it overrun the place? Of course. The People's Liberation Army has soldiers, and People's Armed Police are within Hong Kong right now. And we estimated months ago that there were equivalent of 2 mechanized divisions of People's Armed Police in Shenzhen, just across the border in Guangdong province, that could just sweep in there into the city instantly. But Hong Kong populace has been resilient. They are betting that their best bet is to continue the pro-democracy agitation, because they believe the Beijing to be ultimately crooked and going to renege on the Sino-British treaty that guaranteed Hong Kong autonomy through 2047. And the only way to maintain their autonomy is to continue to agitate. And it's not just rhetoric and people in the street. Jim covered this in a couple of strategy talks we've had within the last 3 months about the importance of Hong Kong to mainland China's economy, plus the Trump administration economic war between the U.S. and China has exposed the weakness of the Chinese economy. Jim speaks of it as being fragile. I think I use the word brittle, but you get the point there. It is huge, powerful, but fragile, and it's been dependent on its interaction with the United States. And as Jim pointed out in a recent strategy talk, China is not energy independent. It must have energy supplies from Russia and primarily Southwest Asia, the Middle East. So it's caught in a dilemma. It's got to interact with the rest of the world. Therefore, sanctions applied by the United States has a disruptive effect on its economic engine. Hong Kong is aware of this. Taiwan's aware of this. South Korea's aware of this. So as worried as I have been about the rise of China and war in the South China Sea, those 7 artificial islands, which now have air bases and missiles, they're very real. I recall a discussion that we had on that. Jim was pointing out they've already got a crossfire capability with anti-ship missiles, if you look at the spread of the artificial islands in there. But I also say, gee, those are really easy targets for standoff weapons from U.S. heavy bombers. Also sea-launched cruise missiles. They gained something, but they also stuck something out there that they could lose in a shooting war. And to the Chinese credit, the Chinese understand this. I think it has a deterrent effect. They also understand what this, the Russians are the ones who are going around talking about all their hypersonic missiles. You need to start looking at some of the things that the U.S., the Norwegians, Even the Japanese have started putting together. I think the European, Japanese, and North American hypersonic weapons will work. That's just an opinion, Jim. I'm not so sure that the Russians will. And the Chinese can read the mail on that. So, Dan, I guess I spent a lot of time on the failed states, but North Korea is really a failed state, too. China is not. Iran is a failing state, shouldn't be. And I didn't even mention Russia because I think Russia realizes it's in the Ukraine quagmire now and the Syrian quagmire. And it's even muted its bullying tactics in the Baltic because of the blowback they've gotten from Finns and Swedes talking about joining NATO. Don't think that doesn't shake up Moscow. And it does, and it should. I'll leave it at that.
Jim, do you have anything?
No, I think that's the thing. I think the big takeaway from all this, what's going to happen next year is the same thing that's been happening in the last year. A lot of these areas where there is conscious, how should I put it, troublemaking, and that would be, Iran, North Korea, and a few of Russia. They don't really have a military option. They're based, and Iran has been very good at this. They always were. I mean, this is a tradition goes back thousands of years. That's why the Arabs are afraid of them. They don't like to attack you head on when they can basically do it indirectly, which is the Iranians have been very good at. And that's why a lot of the outpouring of how should I put it, mourners in Iran for General Soleimani was basically enforced. They were, and the Iranians realize the news gets out because they haven't 100% shut off the internet, but they get to make the first pronouncements, so they get pictures out of hundreds of thousands of people out there, mourning, Soleimani. Most of them are there at gunpoint. I mean, they basically said, like all these death to America and death to Israel mass demonstrations they have several times a year. More and more, these are basically people being told you better go out there if you want to keep your job, or et cetera, et cetera. But the Soleimani is was very disliked, shall we say, hated in Iran because he basically boasted of when they started having the public protests calling for the removal of the religious dictatorship, and a lot of them are calling for the removal of Islam. In fact, what has become very popular in Iran lately, in the last year, I guess, is people realizing, well, it might be nice to go and become a Buddhist or a Christian or whatever, but geez, they'll kill you for that if they find out. So a lot of people are becoming atheists. They're just not going to the mosque anymore.
Jim, there's also a movement to become Zoroastrian again.
Well, but that'd be considered paganism, and they'll cut your head off to make an example. But the point is, yes, a lot of people would, if they didn't have the death threat hanging over them and enforce actually used active death threat, a lot of people would, and I think that's what's going to happen. That the aftermath of Iran, they'll eventually put down this religious dictatorship, and this is nothing new in Iran. The father of the late Shah, the first of his dynasty, he took power when the senior clergy tried to basically take control of the government, and he brought out his troops. He says, "You try and do that, I will kill you all." Now they realized that back then they didn't have the communications to go nationwide with their word, whatever they're calling, and they realized, as has happened before in Iran, they're all right. So we back off. We have an iron Shah, but his son was made more of cloth, and he tried to act tough, but he wasn't tough enough. And the thing again, people don't realize this. 1970s, late 70s, when the Shah was getting in trouble, it wasn't the internet, because the internet didn't exist yet. Well, not as it does now. And there was hardly any cable news. There was no, I think that satellite news was just beginning, but not in the Middle East. But what they did have was cassette tapes. Now, a lot of people and most people in Iran were literate, but they could all listen. and what Khomeini, the guy in exile, the French gave him, asylum. And a lot of European nations are having second thoughts about giving asylum to, but anyway, that's another story. And he was able to basically make these fiery speeches, put them on video, on cassette tapes, and slip those cassette tapes into Iran. Now, one thing that was very popular was I think the Walkman was just coming out, but a lot of people had these basically semi-portable cassette players, and people would buy music and what have you, or they could even send messages because back then there was no cheap international phone calls. So there were a lot of cassette tapes, and they were easy to smuggle in, and this is what really got going. People would sit down every Friday at the mosque. That's Friday is the day you go to the mosque, and they just play a cassette tape. And then the local, imam would get up there and basically comment on it, and basically encourage people for local issues to back this rebellion. Now they regretted it. But the trouble with a dictatorship is once they get in, they're very difficult to get out.
All right, let me make one point on what Khomeini preyed upon then, and because I'm reached a point I've got something else I've got to do here. But Jim, it was corruption of the Pahlavis that Khomeini damned, and now the corruption is the Khomeiniist regime.
Exactly. Well, that's another problem. As we go over that, regularly in strategy page, the corruption is always at the foundation of any political movement. Ad infinitum. Exactly. But the basic problem they have in these countries is once the tyranny, the dictatorship gets in, they're very difficult to get out because, as Austin puts it, their main priority is regime maintenance.
Yeah.
And they're usually very good at it. In fact, the only thing that the Soviet communists, the Russian communists developed in the 20th century was a fairly effective communist police state. The only problem was, as they learned in the 1980s, was that without the underlying economy, eventually people get so desperate economically that they say, well, we just won't. We won't. We'll stop. And that's what basically caused that massive collapse in communist states in Eastern Europe and Russia between 1989 and 1991. But the Chinese, who thought they had it figured out, they said, all right, we'll go fascist. And basically, fascism is a dictatorship with a more or less free market economy. In other words, the state does not try and run the economy in detail like the communists did. That does not work. But if you have a profitable economy, a dictatorship has a lot more leeway to do this and to do that. But the Chinese are finding out even that doesn't work because to have a market economy, it means a lot of people are going to become prosperous. And once they become prosperous, some of them will basically be more than happy to be basic cronies of the dictatorship, but a lot of them are not. The middle class, shall we say, and they say we want freedom, and that's what's happening in Hong Kong. That's what's happening in southern China. You're hearing this. This bothers the Chinese government. They're hearing the same public protests in southern China, where they can crack down a lot more harshly, but they're hearing the same slogans that are being used in Hong Kong, and this basically there's no winning for the dictatorships, but they can stay in power for decades. And this was the tragedy of Russia, where for 70 years the country was crippled by this self-righteous, homicidal or democidal, dictatorship. I calculated once that Russia, if they had not gone communist or dictatorship, they had a constitutional monarchy when they entered World War I. If they were able to somehow hang on to that, which the monarchy was willing to let go of, but there were problems with the war and what have you. Anyway, they would have been much more prosperous, still corrupt and what have you, but they would have been stable by comparison to what they ended up with. In addition, Russia lost about 25% of its population. A non-Bolshevik, a non-dictatorship Russia would have, almost 30% more people today They would probably still have their empire, but that's problematic as well. And people would be a lot better off. But nobody wants to think about that because, especially in Russia, because the Russians hate to admit that we let this happen. That's another factor you have to take into account. A lot of people will keep a horrendous system going for a long time because they don't want to admit it's their fault. Anyway, I suppose we should end it there.
Yeah, but that's a good place to end it, Jim.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, we'll wrap it up, and we'll be looking forward to all the things that are coming this year.
All right,
Thanks.
till later, guys.
Bye.
Bye.